Next, from Springfield, we talked to Mark DePue, the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, about the purpose of the museum's oral history program, his recollections of interviewing politicians and veterans and farmers that shaped the history of Illinois, as well as how modern technology will affect our understanding and learning of history in the future. This runs about 40 minutes.
Mark DePue, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you, Terry.
You are the Director of Oral History here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and we wanted to talk with you, but I think a lot of people are unaware that this project is going on, but it's an important project, and you've brought a lot of interesting people and captured the memories and recollections of a lot of interesting people, some of which the audience will know and some that they don't. But give us an overview before we get into some of the details. What is the scope of your project and the purpose?
It's interesting, I think, because you and I have a lot in common in terms of what our professions are. We started this project or program in 2006, and we started with 3 priorities, and those priorities have not changed. Illinois statecraft is the top of the list, and it's a nice way of saying Illinois politics. But we figure we're ideally located in the state capital and representing Abraham Lincoln, curiously, but I have nothing to do with Abraham Lincoln, and we do very little on that. Again, the priority is to talk to Illinois politicians, but not just them, their aides, press secretaries, chiefs of staff, their political opponents, journalists. We've interviewed several as well, so that's number one. The second priority is agriculture, and that's because, you know, let's face it, agriculture has always been central to the story of Illinois and its history. And oftentimes they think that is a neglected area. We haven't spent as much time recently, but we've already got a couple hundred hours on agriculture that we've collected over the years. And the third priority is kind of a labor of love for me since I'm retired military, and that's Veterans Remember. That's what we call it. So we focus on interviewing veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and we've got several on the Cold War, the Gulf War, the War on Terror as well.
I don't want to spend, well, on the agriculture, well, yeah. I think you did a whole series on that, and of course that's on one hand the state's largest industry, and yet probably the least populated in terms of the people working within that industry. So sometimes it's like below people's radar. What was it that you wanted to bring to the fore that people would know about agriculture?
Yeah, I should say in that particular project, we partnered with the Illinois State Museum. I got on board, I knew I wanted to do something with agriculture. The first year we were there, we found out that Bob Warren, Dr. Bob Warren at the State Museum, was working on a grant proposal, ended up getting a $500,000 grant proposal, and together we filmed 50 plus videos. Actually, that was the projection. We ended up with something like 70, and I'm still doing ag interviews today. He's not anymore doing that. But we looked at every single aspect of agriculture that you could imagine. So it wasn't just the traditional aspects. I kind of focused on my side more on the traditional things and also the capturing some of the history of agriculture. A lot of his were with some of the smaller niche areas of agriculture like beekeeping and pumpkin farming and elk ranching. And we just, basically we covered the gamut. And I've done interviews myself with Charlie Carey, the former president of the Chicago Board of Trade, because I think that's a big part of agriculture in the state. You turn on the radio and you listen to that. We did interviews with Orion Samuelson, who's the voice of WGN on radio. Anybody who recognizes that voice, you know, he's been telling stories for over 50 years.
Within the ag community, he's a national figure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And did one on harness racing, did one with I call them crop dusters, but they call themselves aerial applicators. So a little bit of everything, but to get the diversity of how agriculture is done in Illinois.
And I would say it kind of brings, moving, whether it's military history or the Illinois statecraft, often the public will know, I would argue, the headline information, but they don't know some of the wealth of details about why something happened the way it happened, or some of the many fascinating stories that are involved, let's say within military history. You're talking to World War II veterans. It seems to me as you were talking that a lot of what you're going after is to capture the history of our time. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Absolutely. Oral history democratizes history. It provides the voices of the people who actually were participants in it. So, I've had extensive interviews, as you know, with Governor Thompson, with Governor Edgar, pretty substantial one with Governor Walker as well. But, the folks that you never hear much about is their patronage chief, the term that always rankles people in Illinois, the folks who are involved with the hiring because they have political connections. And that's part of the story, and it's part of understanding their job from their perspective, because there's no shortage of folks who are going to be critical about that side of the process. Or getting the press secretary, the press secretary, Dave Gilbert, for Governor Thompson. Can you imagine the colorful stories that Dave Gilbert has about Thompson on the campaign trail? And he's an important figure, but it's oftentimes those kinds of folks who get lost in the big picture of things. And that's the ones that we really want to focus on and love to do.
You've reminded me just saying that there's a really troubling aspect to some of recent history. I think the public thinks that since we've had television from the 1950s, that all of this stuff is being saved and is available. And the troubling aspect that so much of what has been recorded, even in modern times, I mean in the last 10 years or 20 years at local TV stations, is often destroyed. One day I was visiting a TV station here in Central Illinois, and they were literally throwing out their old videotapes. Well, that was years of local history of the stories, the issues. So it's shocking that we don't preserve more of this, and that, as you know, I mean, I credit you with to doing what you're doing, because so many of these stories, as the individuals, the World War II veterans pass away, or as our famous politicians pass away, that it's just a shame that no one is out gathering this. So when you interview someone, let's talk about Governor Thompson, who often in the public's mind they think of maybe still as a young man, because we remember him as a young governor, and now is probably around 80 years old, I would guess.
He just turned 80.
What are some of the stories that you've interviewed him, and what did you glean from him that stands out?
Well, I don't know if this is a condemnation of how I do things or it's to my credit, but he and I finished off with something like 63 hours of interviews, because I figured I'm going to have just one chance to sit down with him and going to drill down as much as I possibly can. And a guy like Thompson has so many memories. He was involved in so much. But a couple of the highlights, the things that he really wanted to focus on in his interviews, was the Build Illinois project. And people our age would remember about Build Illinois. He is really proud of the new White Sox Stadium. And that story about, you've heard this story before, I know you have, about the night that the clock stopped at midnight so that they could get the legislation done, and he and Madigan working the floor to make sure they got the votes they needed to build the White Sox Stadium. He was involved with the 9/11 Commission, so we had one session when that's all we talked about, went through that whole process in detail. He was...
and just that alone is significant history.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Entirely different from Illinois, but significant to capture.
Mm-hmm. He was a good friend of George Ryan, so that was kind of an emotional session where we talked about the George Ryan trial, his time as a prisoner, him being released, and getting those sides of the story as well. Not the kind of stuff that you're going to see in official papers. And as you mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to do in this, Dr. Tom Schwartz was the state historian when I was hired. It was his intention. He knew that the kind of papers we were getting from politicians just didn't have the meat on the bones that we wanted to have, and that saw oral history as the way to put some meat on the bones.
And it goes, you bring up a point. So much of history, as we have the books behind us, is printed history.
Yeah.
In this era, it should be multimedia history. At least we can have the emotion of the person speaking about it. Now, because none of us are funded properly in the state, a lot of what you do when you talk about 60 hours, people might think that's all televised. It's mostly just the audio recordings, is that correct? But you also do some video.
Yeah, and for both Thompson and Edgar, which are big projects, and not just focusing on those two individuals, but their opponents and their staffers and people who worked in administration and a variety of things. The vast majority of that is audio interviews. But in both Thompson and Edgar's case, we focused in on one particular election campaign that was especially important to them and to Illinois history, and videotaped it. So in Edgar's case, it was the 1990 election, where he ran against Hartigan, and very close election. And in Thompson's case, it was a no-brainer. It was the 1982 election. That was actually his third election. But the 1982 election, and the first time he ran against Adlai Stevenson, and at the end of the day in November, on election day, it was 5,074 votes that separated the two. So the results weren't known until about a week before the inauguration, when the Supreme Court decided the state wasn't going to go through a total recount, and that vote that the election board had validated on election night would stand, and declared Thompson the governor.
Interesting, because it's kind of a precursor to what we saw in 2000 with the presidential election,
Yeah.
where the Supreme Court ordered a stop to the counting.
Yeah, very much so. And Stevenson had a lot to say. I've interviewed Adlai Stevenson about the 82 and the 86 election. Boy, there's an interesting contrast in the two men and their style, and the importance both of them saw in that election. But Stevenson still insists that he won that election, and he talked about hanging chads in the 1982 election, if you can imagine, because they were just trying out that new punch card.
For people who would hear this and are interested, are these interviews that you've conducted, are they available online?
That is our goal from day one, to get all of this available to the public as much as possible. That is well, you understand how this works. That's a big part of the work that we have to do. It's not just doing the interview and then it's over. Most of the work happens after the interview is completed. But it's all available on our website. That site is www.oralhistory.illinois.gov. And then as you go to that main page, on the right-hand side, you'll see all of the different projects listed, Illinois Statecraft. So if you go to Illinois Statecraft, you'd find now you have a selection of, I believe, 8 different projects within that. So you've got Governor Thompson's series, you've got Governor Edgar's series, Governor Walker, he has a smaller series, but we've got one on the Equal Rights Amendment fight. We've got a series with legislators. We've got a collection with different journalists. And one of the donated collections we have that's on that particular page is a series of interviews that was done about 4 years ago during the 100th anniversary of Reagan's birth, I'm sorry. So Reagan in Illinois is the name of that project.
One of the most, of course, in our time and recent time, about 8 years ago or so, was the impeachment of Rod Blagojevich, which in the history of Illinois will certainly stand out. Have you done anything on that?
I've interviewed quite a few people where, there's a short story or a little bit of discussion about Blagojevich, and we have a cooperation with Bernie Saraki, who wrote the book Just Cause, the book about the impeachment trial in the legislature. And there's nothing up on our website yet, but our hope is that Bernie will go back and re-interview the people that he did in terms of doing the research for that book as oral history interviews, and that they will be up available on the website. That's a long-term project.
As people hear this, let's, for those of us, maybe it sounds like a silly question, for those of us who like history, but why does it matter? What's the point of all this?
Because it's not just the things you read in the newspaper. It's, as you started off by saying at the very beginning, it's the why the politicians made the decisions they did, the passion that was involved with particular issues that they were pursuing, to get a much greater in-depth understanding of why things happen, when they happen. And it's, our job as the oral historian to provide that historical context. But, when I first started, this is kind of an aside from politics, but when I first started, I was thinking, everybody does interviews with veterans. So I love to do them. The public is very interested in them, but are we going to add historical knowledge and facts? And I can tell you that some of the stories I've collected have definitely deepened my understanding of military history, of veterans history, and I think the public as well. So we are, even for World War II and Korea especially, and for Vietnam now, we're adding to the corpus of knowledge about those wars, because it's from the individual's perspective and what they are involved in.
And I will share, I mean, I've had the opportunity, which you treasure, to interview various people. One day I interviewed 3 recipients of the Medal of Honor, and to hear one of them was Sammy Davis, who was from Illinois, from Vietnam. It's one thing to hear that someone won the Medal of Honor, but to have someone tell their story in depth about how they were knocked unconscious and had to level their artillery gun to the enemy who was coming in so fast, and to hear that, where these people are fighting for their lives, it gives you, I would say history is never really just an intellectual exercise. You have to understand the emotions of the moment, whether it's someone fighting for their life on a battlefield, or a governor or a president making a decision. And it seems to me ironic that sometimes the stories like The West Wing on TV or House of Cards, while they're fictionalized, if people understand how a policy is developed, but through all the machinations of politics and wheeling and dealing, it's not too terribly different than sometimes what goes on behind the scenes in Illinois politics.
Yeah, how the sausage is made, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, we definitely get an aspect of that as well.
When you, how do you prepare for an interview? When you say you do 60 hours, and I think with Governor Edgar, I think you said you did something like 40 hours.
57, I think, 57. With Edgar.
So extensive time. How do you prepare for those interviews? That's obviously, I'm normally doing a half an hour or an hour at a time. Entirely different process to do 60 hours.
We started with both of those to develop a pretty detailed, as much detail as possibly could, a timeline of their lives and all of the personal events, but especially all the political events in their lives. And then it's that for a typical interview, let's say it's somebody not at the scale of an Edgar or Thompson, we sit down with them and do a pre-interview. And I write down all of the different highlights of their events, and I'm basically in those taking a chronological approach so that I'm hitting all of the highlights. And inevitably, when you do the pre-interviews, you start to pull out some of the stories, the colorful aspects, the things that you're really going after. So you sprinkle in your notes that, hey, ask her about the ERA fight in 1982 or something like that. And then I go back and I develop a much more thorough outline and do all the necessary background research that's involved. I always feel like I'm not doing enough, but I realize I don't have to be the expert. I have to know enough to ask the right questions to elicit the revealing responses we're looking for.
I'm reminded again of that interview, which we have online, that I did with the Medal of Honor winner, Sammy Davis. And I'm asking because you may have the same experience, or do you have the same experience? But in his case, he started giving almost like a rote recollection of what happened. But after about 2 or 3 minutes of telling the story, it's like he went into a zone where the emotions of that moment came back. And it was just fascinating. Once he got emotionally himself back into telling the story, do you have that where when you scratch the surface of something and hear this emotional recollection comes back to the fore, and maybe you were unaware of it, or it's just surprising when you hit that?
Well, it's certainly the goal to get them to open up and to reveal more and to get them to reflect, and it happens all the time as well. You made me think about things I haven't thought about in 60 years or 70 years.
Which is the point, right?
Yeah, the point. Yeah, the emotions that's a tricky business when you unlock those emotions. And I've had a couple of very interesting occasions where they get to a point and suddenly it seems like mentally they blocked out something themselves. You know, I'm trying to drag out stuff that they have been trying to forget for decades. And sometimes they just say they don't want to do it in the first place. That's not uncommon for some of this. But there are those moments, just as you were talking about.
You know, I one time said, just as in passing, on 9/11, those of us who were alive and lived through 9/11, that we often heard how veterans didn't want to talk about the war. When we collectively went through such a horrible exercise or event as 9/11, that who wants to go back and revisit that, because it's such an ugly emotion, that maybe then we can have a little inkling into why those who have suffered through some horrible wartime experience really are not looking forward to bringing that back to the fore when they've tried so much to put it behind them.
Yeah, you mentioned the Medal of Honor winners. I've gotten the sense doing this that there was this moment in time, and it was in the 1990s, a decade before I even started, but it was about then that the World War II veterans were finally at the point in their lives where they were willing to share some of these stories. And so we're kind of at that same point now with the Vietnam folks, that these are very painful stories for them to share. And it's just difficult when you're that close to it in terms of the amount of time that's elapsed. And it takes some time for them to process themselves. We're talking decades now that they finally got to the point where they're willing to share some of the stories and reflect on things. And quite frankly, a lot of the times, they don't remember the details at all anyway. They're not there anymore. There's no way they could possibly bring them up.
For those who haven't been here, the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, they're actually two different buildings and kind of have two different missions. We're sitting in the library in your office, which is more about research. And if someone wants to come and do research on some aspect of Illinois history, they can do that here. The museum, I would recommend, if people are bringing their families, they go to the museum, and it tells in a very interesting way the story of Abraham Lincoln and his life and presidency. But also at the museum, there's a stage, the Union Theater, and you are involved on occasion. The museum, puts on these events that are also fascinating, lectures from people. Recently, General John Borling from Vietnam, who was a prisoner of war for 6.5 years, gave a fascinating talk. But also I remember early on when the museum opened up, they had a series called A Night to Remember. Dan Rostenkowski was there, different people on subsequent nights. Some of these are also recorded by the museum, audiovisual department. Do you ever have occasion to go back and look at those resources when you're doing your research and preparation for some of your interviews?
Probably not as much as I should. Obviously, for the General Borling presentation, I had the chance to interview him. That one was 31 hours because it wasn't just about his 6.5 years in prison camp. That's absolutely what he didn't want to do, is just focus on that. So we talked about his entire career. But the one project that I really enjoyed doing, in 2015, we had a series of presentations called The Evening with the Creators. And in that case, I did have to go back and do some research. And these were people with the creation of this institution. So to get ready for a series of panel discussions, I essentially had to go out and do quite a few interviews myself with some of the main people who were responsible with the creation of the museum in the first place. The creative genius of Bob Rogers and BRC Imagination Arts that created the exhibits, talking to Tom Schwartz about the background information, meeting with Julie Cellini and Susan Mogerman about the creation of the museum and the library from the standpoint of working in the agency, being the chairman of the board of trustees, and there's quite a bit of politics in all of that as well, as you might imagine.
We should a little bit about your background. You're not just a academic historian. What give us a little bit of your background, and you also include some military history.
Well, just the thumbnail sketch, I graduated from the military academy, West Point, in 1976, had a little over 5 years in active duty. Stepped out of that would have been in 1981, went to graduate school at the University of Iowa, the real U of I is the way I look at things, and got my master's, decided to take a full-time job at Western Illinois teaching ROTC. So I was back full-time with the military, but really representing the Guard at that time. Retired from the National Guard in 2001, had a chance to command a Air Defense Battalion up in Chicago for 3 years, and then came back to Springfield again. Spent most of my time in Springfield. Retired in 2001, and then went back and finished up my dissertation and wrote a couple books. And thankfully, I wrote a book about the 233rd Military Police Company that had just come back from their one-year deployment in Iraq in 2004, at the same time I was finishing up my dissertation. And it occurred to me, wow, this is the next chapter of my dissertation, because the dissertation was on the evolution of the citizen soldier in American history. So I spent a year interviewing them about their experiences in Iraq. Now there's the opposite of World War II. These guys had memories that were only a year old, and those emotions were much rawer, as you might imagine.
Right.
But having that book, having that experience really helped me not just land this job, but to be successful in the job as well.
To what extent, when you interview a veteran who's seen combat in current time, in let's say Afghanistan or Iraq, how does their experience compare? Is there a difference between the life of the citizen soldier between today and 70-something years ago in World War II, or is it pretty much uniform?
Well, I've always maintained that once the soldier gets to combat, the differences quickly go away. But, my fascination has always been that friction that's existing between the regular military and the citizen soldier side of the equation, because the regular folks are oftentimes likely to kind of look down their nose and say, these are a bunch of amateurs. There's always that amateur element in American history that's kind of threaded through there. The same discussion about politicians. Do we want to have the professional class of politicians or citizen politicians? Same kind of dynamic going on. But once they get to combat, that kind of all goes away. And what struck me about the 233rd, these are civilians. They're police officers and corrections officers and waitresses and students and a wide variety of different kind of experiences, and suddenly they're expected to go to Baghdad, and they're the very first MP company to get to Baghdad. And so the company commander for the MP unit drives around with some Iraqi he'd never met before who's saying, over there, that used to be a police station, and no, that's a police station over there. And they were quickly joined by other MP companies, but I looked at this, these guys were the ideal. They didn't have this cavalry or infantry mentality where you need to meet and destroy the enemy. They had a police officer mentality, and that's exactly what they needed to have on the ground at the time.
There's been so much history of late. Not far from where we are sitting is the old state capitol, which has history throughout the years, but it was there in 2007, I guess, that Barack Obama announced his presidency, and there in the summer of 2008 that he also announced his running mate was Joe Biden. So we even have current history. How much history do you, we talk about oral history, so you're not necessarily going back to the Civil War period, or how far back do you go, and what have you been able to capture that maybe now may be gone as far as the recollections of people?
Well, the definition of oral history is interviewing people about their own personal memories. So we can't, and we certainly sometimes sit down with somebody about their World War II experiences, and if the opportunity presents itself, then I'm going to hear about their family's history back in the Civil War, but that's all secondhand, so it's not the same level of quality. That primary source document is talking about individuals, about their personal experiences. And we have to make some trade-offs as well, and the politicians, talking to the politicians is especially important. The first time we had an advisory board meeting about what to do with Illinois politics, Governor Edgar was sitting in the room, and the very first thing he said, I believe, was, well, what you don't want to do is talk to a politician while they're still in the arena. You need to wait until they've made the decision and actually retired, because otherwise you're not going to get a candid conversation. Even then, it's hard to sometimes get a candid conversation with these guys, as you know. And then the subject came up, well, gosh, we've got the President of the United States used to be in the legislature. Shouldn't we be interviewing people in the Illinois Senate about that? And again, Edgar said, no, because, you know, they're either a Republican and they're going to demean what he was doing in the legislature, in the Senate, or they're going to be Democrats and going to be very complimentary. You're not going to get that candid conversation. So I've gotten a few of those with recently retired Illinois state senators, and we certainly hope to do more of that in the future. But I think that kind of gives you the dynamic that we're looking for there.
And on the other hand, I would say, aside from the oral history, you are quite an expert in various fields, and recently you gave, as we are taping this in 2016, we are going through a 4-year period where it's the 100th anniversary of the First World War. You recently gave a address at the Lincoln Museum on trench warfare in World War I, which was fascinating, and I think ran about an hour and a half, which, you know, to get the information that you gave in an hour and a half, people would probably have to read 10 books, which I suspect they're not going to do, but it's worth sitting. And plus, I don't know to what extent you look at this. To me, that seems to be such a resource for, we don't know what technology is coming in the future.
Yeah.
But we've wired the schools, and so if there are classrooms studying about the First World War, they can listen to either all or a portion of your lecture, and some of these people that you are now capturing, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will be able to hear that. Isn't it fascinating, because even our movies, we're not even at 100 years to where there was sound in movies. That was 1927.
Yeah.
How do you ever think about how modern technology, to where we have their facial expressions, to where we have their voice telling these stories, how that is going to alter the understanding and of history as compared to the whole previous period of history beforehand, which was all text?
Terry, that sounds like a great conversation over dinner sometime between the two of us. I probably haven't thought about it as much as I should, but I certainly have an understanding that if I look at our grandparents, the things they saw in their lives from maybe when they were born in the 1870s or 1880s up through the 1950s, imagine how different the world was for them. Now, we think the world is incredibly different for us, and it certainly is because of the digital age and technology and the internet and things like that. But we're talking about from riding a horse or walking everywhere you went to having railroads and telephones and televisions and the whole gamut of airplanes, and suddenly you can communicate across the country in just seconds, and that was never the case before. I don't think people have an understanding and appreciation for that. And you mentioned the presentations. I started doing presentations on the Korean War because that was one of my fascinations that I mentioned to you earlier. And people just don't know the first thing about it. So I did a series of presentations, Korean War. And then when we got to the Civil War sesquicentennial, you know, we didn't seem to be doing too much, so I volunteered. Maybe this was my mistake. I volunteered to do a series of presentations on the major battles of the Civil War. And I think we ended up with 13, focusing on 13 battles over that time period. And then threw in the movies of the Civil War, because I'm kind of a movie junkie as well. And those seem to be very popular. And my approach in all of that, and the World War I stuff as well, is when I struggle to understand something, I just keep figuring it out until I do understand it, and then try to present it in the way that the public can understand it as well. And trench warfare is a perfect example. Who in their right mind would get out of that trench and run across no man's land to almost certain death or injury? You know, it boggles my mind.
Well, and it goes to show how we often say about how generals are fighting the last war, and World War I, with all that modern technology, the strategies that weren't much different than the Civil War, where you
exactly.
were fighting, you know, with guns that weren't much more than muskets. And I guess that's one of the things to where we can learn from the values, again, of history, is we can learn and apply these lessons and even ask ourselves, given the new technology, are we fighting the last war? What do we need to change given the technology we have today? I sometimes often think that applies not only to warfare, but I wonder how is social media changing our democracy? Are we running campaigns as if it's still the old days where it's just television? And you look at what Donald Trump is doing. Interestingly, he's almost more attuned to the social media aspect than some of these professional campaign advisors.
And that was the thing that really propelled Obama to success, is that he tapped into all that social media and got that energy going for his campaign. So you're absolutely right. That's a great parallel to how our politics are changing, because not just the social media, but look at how it's changed, because the Fairness Act was revised back in the late 80s, and suddenly you have Rush Limbaugh and then this plethora of other conservative voices on the radio, and then you've got Fox News and conservative cable TV, and so you have all these different places that people now get their information, and that has certainly revolutionized the way American politics has been done for the last 30 years.
Let me, before time is growing short, but on this project, neither you or I are getting any younger. But it seems to me it's such a critical thing to continue to do through the decades. Let me give you a platform to make a bit of a pitch about, there's so much that the state spends money on, and I often think for pennies on the dollar we can capture things as you're working on, because first of all, you have some volunteers that work with you, but basically you're an enterprise of one professional. Are you funded by the library, by the museum, by the state? How do you get your funds? And if you had more, what else could be done?
Well, as you know, the Library Museum, Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, is run by the state of Illinois. So now we don't have a budget, and we're working on very thin budgets. We have some profit potential over in the museum, but that funds only a limited amount of things. I really haven't had to restrict my travel at all. The story of Illinois politics isn't going to end. That's something that we need to continue to build on in the next generation and beyond.
And as you say, hopefully you can get all of this rich material that you have available online, which is, we talked about the technology. Now people don't physically have to come to a library to access a lot of this. And lastly, though, too, what about just having are there going to be transcripts so that for people who are deaf and all, can they, are they going to be would you print them out, or are they going to be on the video when you have video, or how would those be available?
Well, that level of technology is beyond me right now, but our goal from day one, Terry, has been that there's not only all of the audio and or video available on the website, but that there's a transcript as well. So we've got about 800 interviews that we've collected. There's roughly 660 that are already on the web. There's a lot more to come, obviously. And a sizable percentage of those already have transcripts completed. The goal from day one was to have transcripts for everything. Not so much the same dynamic for donated collections, but the ones that we've done ourselves, to have transcripts completed. But that's a very long process. I'm kind of proud, actually. You might be surprised at this, Terry, but I'm kind of proud that my transcribers now, when I'm assigning out projects for them to do, I'm giving them interviews that were done in 2013, in September of 2013. So,
proud that you're that caught up.
That we're only 3 years behind, but consider that these are volunteers, very talented people who help out on transcribing and editing, and amazingly dedicated. And I think they love it, and they come back to it so much because they get caught up on the stories. They like to hear these stories firsthand that these people have to share.
Well, and I should say too, it's not just for the hearing impaired that we have a transcript. If there's a transcript, someone can do a word search, and you might be able to find the specific point of an interview that you want to hone in on, rather than just delving into 60 hours.
If you're a journalist, if you're a researcher, if you're a scholar, if you're working on a dissertation or you're writing a book, you're not going to try to wade through a 4-hour audio interview. You want to go right to the issues that you want to focus on, and that's what the transcripts allows you to do. So we have searchable PDF transcripts when we get them done.
Mark DePue, we could talk for hours more. It's always fun, and you and I both love this as a subject matter, but time grows short. Well, thank you for joining us. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Well, I'm all for that. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.